The reason I need to talk today is that 4 months ago, my wife of 8 years passed away from lung cancer. She battled the disease for nearly 3 years before it finally took her life, and during this entire process, my relationship with her son from her previous marriage has been difficult, to say the least. I discovered a letter in which she instructed my stepson to pretend to like me for money, so I cut him off financially to see if his recent kindness was genuine. The situation was made more difficult by Michael's paternal grandparents, George and Patricia, who were very involved in Michael's life after their son's death and who had given my wife a lot of support when she unexpectedly became a single parent. Michael was in a car accident when he was only 6 years old, and by the time I entered the picture, he was still processing that loss. Michael made it clear he didn't want me around my wife and me for about a year and a half before we were married, but that time didn't soften his attitude toward me. My wife had been in between jobs when her first husband died, and even with life insurance, their finances had taken a serious hit because of this history. She felt obligated to George and Patricia because they had supported her and Michael through their darkest moments, and were Michael's last link to his father, so cutting them off was never an option, even though they didn't like me and believed my wife had moved on too quickly despite having waited 4 years. My wife whispered an apology, but I told her it was okay because I understood their protective instincts toward their grandson. However, their behavior persisted for years after we were married, so I took on all the responsibilities of a father. I drove Michael to school and helped with his homework. The first time I met George and Patricia was at Michael's school play. I held out my hand to George, but he looked at it and turned away. When Michael was 13, he had stayed out past his curfew with friends, and when I told him he was grounded for the weekend, he threw his backpack on the floor and said, "You can't ground me, you're not my dad." When my wife backed me up, Michael stormed off to his soccer games, cooked meals, and did everything else a parent does, but he rarely showed any appreciation. He would frequently remind me that I wasn't his real dad whenever I tried to enforce household rules or discipline him. Room and called his grandparents. 20 minutes later, I got a furious call from George telling me that I had no right to discipline his grandson. These kinds of things have happened frequently over the years, and although my wife has always supported me, she was unable to stop George and Patricia from destroying our relationship by accusing me of trying to replace his father. I knew that Michael was having a hard time adjusting to new family dynamics while still grieving for his father. I made an effort to exercise patience, but as the years went by, his lack of interest in me didn't get any better. When Michael was 15, he declined to go on a family vacation with us, opting instead to stay with his grandparents. My wife was devastated, but she didn't bring up the subject that week. George and Patricia took Michael to see his father's grave, and then all of his favorite spots. When we got back, Michael was even more aloof than before, and by the time he started high school, things had settled into a pattern of tolerance. We developed an unspoken routine where I would prepare dinner and Michael would eat quickly and retreat to his room on weekends. He would leave early and return late, and we hardly ever spoke beyond the necessities. He was openly hostile but remained distant and formal, spending more time with friends than at home, which decreased our conflicts. I continued to fulfill my parental duties without expecting much in return, accepting that this might be as good as our relationship would get. Our lives were completely turned upside down when my wife was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer 3 years ago. For the first year, she continued to work while undergoing treatment, but eventually, her condition worsened to the point where she had to quit. I became the sole provider, handling all of our finances and her medical care. However, these efforts usually ended with Michael finding an excuse to leave early or not participate at all. That moment of unity was brief, though, as Michael quickly returned to his typical avoidance patterns. We had some savings, and our health insurance covered the majority of the treatment costs, but they were still significant out-of-pocket expenses. In addition, Michael was getting ready for college despite our financial situation, insisting on attending an expensive university across town. We spent more than 3 hours in the same room as we processed the news. There was no conversation, but for once we shared a space without tension, the country rather than the state school where he was partially subsidized. When my wife attempted to explain our financial situation, Michael accused her of not being concerned about his future. The argument left her drained and crying, and her treatment that month was especially aggressive. Her distress was too great for her to handle, so I pulled Michael aside and offered to pay for his tuition and living expenses if he agreed not to cause any. Michael accepted my offer right away, saying that he could have any kind of education he wanted as long as he kept the peace at home. He went one step further, asking for an off-campus apartment rather than the more convenient dorm accommodations, claiming that the dorms were too noisy for studying. However, I later learned from his social media that he was regularly throwing parties. After some argument, I gave in primarily because I didn't have the energy to argue about it. But to his credit, Michael kept his end of the agreement. He was truly kind to his. When Michael visited home, he would spend hours sitting with his mother watching her favorite shows or just talking. He would bring her small gifts from school and take pictures to show her his life there. These moments gave my wife a lot of joy. When she was too weak to get out of bed, he would bring his laptop and show her virtual tours of museums. Whether this was because of our agreement or because he genuinely cared about her, comfort didn't matter to me. What mattered was seeing my wife happy in her last days. As far as she was concerned, George and Patricia were paying for Michael's education. She had always wanted to visit my wife, but she was unaware of our arrangement. I never cleared up this misunderstanding because I would rather not put her through any more stress. She died believing that her son and I had naturally strengthened our relationship. As my wife's condition worsened, I took a leave of absence from work to care for her full-time. The medical bills kept coming in, and I had to take money out of our retirement savings. The week before his mother's death, Michael flew home, and he mostly avoided me, which was our usual pattern of interaction. He would sit with his mother while I made meals or took care of his medications, then leave the room when I entered. We continued this dance of avoidance even as we both watched the person we loved pass away, and on the day before her funeral, something unexpected happened. Michael's tuition and apartment were additional financial burdens, but I never mentioned this to my wife because she had enough to worry about. Michael came up to me in the kitchen while I was calling funeral attendees. He stood clumsily for a moment before thanking me for taking care of her, and then he broke down and hugged me. I was already having a hard time processing my loss, so I was taken aback by his sudden outburst of emotion. I hugged him in return, and we sobbed together as our years of tension seemed to melt away in our shared grief. Following this incident, Michael's attitude toward me changed significantly. He assisted with funeral arrangements and stayed by my side. He apologized for his past behavior during the service, which I never expected to happen, and said that he had mistreated me. He explained that he had been afraid of losing his relationship with his father and had directed his anger towards me. He acknowledged that his behavior had recently gotten worse because he was afraid of becoming an orphan and losing his second parent, and he had lashed out at me, demanding financial support, while purposefully remaining cold because it was easier than Michael's behavior toward me improved significantly after that day. He stayed for 3 weeks after the funeral before returning to university, and we had some pleasant conversations. He helped around the house without being asked, and he even cooked dinner twice, something he had never done before. I faced his fears, told him I understood, and suggested that going forward we try to build a better relationship. I explained that I never wanted to replace his father, but hoped we could at least be friendly with each other. We were not close, but compared to our previous relationship, this was a dramatic improvement. I thought we were finally building the relationship I had always hoped for until last week when I unintentionally found something troubling while Michael was taking a shower during one of his visits home. He started calling frequently after returning to school and flying back every few weekends to visit. During these visits, we would go on drives or watch sports together. I knew I shouldn't have read it, but I couldn't help it. The letter was creased and worn as if it had been read numerous times, and in it my wife expressed how happy she was that Michael had finally accepted her illness and had been spending quality time with her. A folded piece of paper was protruding from his backpack, and I instantly recognized my wife's handwriting despite the shaky script that characterized her writing in her final months. The first paragraph concentrated on their relationship. However, in the second paragraph, my wife wrote that Michael should attempt to mend our relationship after she passed away. She said that we had struggled financially since she became too sick to work, and that although George and Patricia might have helped him, they wouldn't be around forever. She suggested that he should connect with me because I was kind and would take care of him, but she urged him not to burn bridges with the only parental figure he would have left. What disturbed me wasn't when Michael came out of the shower, I confronted him about the letter. He stopped in the doorway of his room, a look of shock spreading across his face when he saw the paper in my hands. The entire second paragraph about me, however, had angry pen marks on it. When I crossed it out, the paper was torn in places where the pen had pressed too hard, suggesting that Michael had reacted with intense anger to that section of the letter. There were even small holes in the paper where the pen had punctured through. Michael sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his damp hair, and explained that when his mother's lawyer had given him the letter shortly after her death, he had been upset by the suggestion that he should make amends with me for financial reasons. He thought that his relationship with me should be motivated by practical considerations rather than genuine affection, which infuriated him. "Where did you find that?" he finally asked. "It was sticking out of your backpack. I recognized your mother's handwriting." He chose to follow his mother's advice regardless, which is why he had approached me before the funeral. He said that the paragraph that was crossed out was a reflection of his initial reaction rather than his current feelings. At first, he said, he was just doing what his mother wanted, but over the past few months, he has come to realize that she was right about you, not because of money, but because you've always been there, even when I made things difficult for you." He acknowledged that his behavior change was calculated at first, but that he had grown to love you. I looked at his face to see if he was telling the truth after years of coldness, followed by a sudden change that coincided with more potential financial need, but I found it difficult to fully trust his words. He asked me not to misinterpret the crossed-out paragraph, saying he had marked it during his initial angry reaction but had since changed his perspective. I gave Michael the time he needed to process this information, and I asked him to stay with his grandparents until his flight back to university the following day. After 2 days of thinking, I came up with a test to see if Michael's newfound warmth was genuine or just driven by financial interests. I texted him to say that I was willing to forgive the past, but that going forward, he would need to arrange his funding. He protested, crying, and insisted that his affection was now genuine, but I insisted that I needed space. He persisted in arguing, following me from room to room until I firmly repeated my request, reluctantly packing his things and leaving. Michael was unaware that my wife and I had a joint will that would not be revealed until both of us died, despite what my wife had implied in the letter. We had set aside money specifically for Michael's future along with some family jewelry, and I had included him in my portion of the will since I have no close family members to leave my assets to. For tuition and living expenses, with only 2 years of university left, this wasn't an unreasonable request. Many students work through college or take out loans. Unaware of this clause, he responded to my text message promptly and persistently. Within minutes he called, but I put it on voicemail. He then sent me a barrage of texts, each one more urgent than the last, pleading with me to change my mind. For the following week, he sent hundreds of messages pleading with me to reconsider, one of which read, "I can't handle losing Mom and dealing with this too. I need your support right now. I know I was awful to you for years, but I'm trying to make things right. Please don't pull the rug out from under me." The volume and urgency of his messages made me wonder if I was being too harsh, or if this test was a way to punish me for years of rejection. I was also dealing with my grief, and this situation was only worsening. For a few days, I didn't reply to his messages because I wasn't sure how to handle it after talking to a few trusted friends. A friend pointed out that even if Michael's change of heart was initially driven by financial considerations, the fact that he was now panicking might indicate he truly valued our improved relationship regardless of how it started. I messaged him to apologize for the situation, but I also said that if he truly wanted a relationship with me, he would understand why I had doubts after years of coldness followed by a sudden change that coincided with potential financial need. I gave him emotional support but insisted that he would need to become financially independent. I explained that if he agreed to these terms, we could continue to develop our relationship. If not, that would tell me everything I needed to know. 7 days went by without a response. Michael was supposed to visit over the weekend, and normally I would buy his plane tickets, but this time I didn't. I wondered if he would still come without the financial incentive, and to my surprise, he did arrive that weekend. He bought his ticket, and as soon as I opened the door, he embraced me and started crying. The unadulterated emotion of the moment reminded me that despite our complex past, we were both mourning the same person. His clothes were wrinkled as if he had packed quickly, and his eyes had dark circles under them. He appeared worn out. I invited him in, and we had an open discussion, and he admitted that my suspicions were valid given our past and his response to the letter. After thinking about the situation for the past 7 days, he realized that what I was asking wasn't unreasonable. He told me that he was grateful that I had even forgiven him for how poorly he had treated me over the years, even though the prospect of financial independence was intimidating. He also understood that both of us needed to start over. At first, the paragraph about me had angered him because it felt like his mother was pushing him toward me for practical rather than emotional reasons. Contrary to what his mother had suggested, there was money in our will designated for him. I offered to assist him in accessing some of those funds until he found work, but he refused, stating that he needed to prove to me and himself that his change of heart was sincere. "I've been dependent on people my entire life," he said, "so maybe it's time for me to learn to stand on my own." I respected his decision, and we spent the remainder of the weekend organizing his job search. 3 days later, I got a call from George and Patricia, who were furious with me for severing Michael's financial support and making him work through college. I attempted to explain that this was a mutual decision and that I had even offered to help him with the money his mother had left him, but they wouldn't listen. They accused me of being selfish and hoarding all the money for myself, saying, "You've just been waiting for a chance to abandon him." I called Michael to find out what had happened, and he explained that he had casually mentioned to his grandparents that he was seeking employment because he had decided to become financially independent. They offered to increase his allowance, but he declined, saying that his mother would be ashamed of you after everything our family has been through, and this is how you treat her son. Patricia added, "You never wanted him in the first place." I told Michael that he didn't feel I owed his grandparents an explanation, that this was between him and me, and that their opinion didn't matter to me. Michael apologized for the misunderstanding and offered to speak with his grandparents, but I suggested he concentrate on his studies instead. George and Patricia had assumed right away that I had forced this change and were demanding that I continue supporting Michael as I had for the previous 2 years. As for my relationship with my stepson, it was finally developing into something genuine built on mutual respect rather than obligation or financial dependence, but I was still curious, AITA, about testing my stepson's loyalty after finding a concerning letter hash update. It has been 3 weeks since my last post, and their reaction, while unpleasant, had an unexpected benefit in that I no longer felt obligated to keep in touch with them. Help me work through my grief and guilt by reminding me that setting boundaries isn't the same as abandonment. Michael has returned to visit twice, and on his first visit, he brought news that he had found a part-time job. The pay isn't high, but it covers some of his daily expenses. My brother also pointed out something that I hadn't thought of. By pushing Michael toward independence, I might be giving him the best gift possible, self-reliance. We looked over his budget together that weekend for a resident advisor position for the upcoming semester, which would provide free housing and a small stipend. Despite his new job, he still doesn't have enough money for tuition. I reminded him about the money his mother had saved, but he declined once more. Instead, he applied for more scholarships and is thinking about taking out a student loan to cover the remaining amount. His determination to manage this on his own continues to amaze me. On his second visit, Michael brought a folder with all the scholarship information. What has surprised me the most is Michael's response to his grandparents' behavior. After learning what they were doing, he called them directly and told them to stop interfering. According to Michael, the conversation didn't go well. He had meticulously organized everything with spreadsheets tracking deadlines and requirements. He had submitted almost 20 applications, each of which required essays and recommendations. They accused him of being brainwashed by me and threatened to take away his allowance if he didn't change his mind. Michael assured them that they could keep their money, which confirmed to me that his change of heart was sincere. He later told me that he should have confronted his grandparents years ago, particularly when they were under my mother's influence, and they always made me feel like I had to make a decision. Between your recollection and my dad's, he acknowledged throughout our talk that I never recognized, up until today, how unfair that was.